Hello, viewers of Spell, and welcome to the Spell-Re and our compilation of What If Midoriya Was a D&D Sorcerer. Now, at the time of doing this, the What If Deku was a wielder of the Sacred Sword, or had the Sacred Sword, is not doing so well, so next week will be more What If Midoriya's parents were villains, or maybe What If Midoriya Was Yami's reincarnation, since the compilation of that video did super well. Try to keep the ball going. I might also revisit an idea I had a little while back, which was, what if Midoriya had a symbiote? But without further ado, let's get to this compilation video. We see a man experimenting in his tower. Zeref, the half-elf sorcerer and wizard, experimenting on ancient relics involving dimensional travel. According to the text, you could use this to travel to worlds. Many people believe this is how humans became so populous in the multiverse. The man had green hair and was experimenting late into the night when he had found something, a way to travel. It was actually rather simple. You set up and you connected one point to the other through the ethereal plane. It was rather simple and worked very similar to other teleportation gates. The only difference is you had to combine it with other spells, like plane shift, to create a stable gate. He knew this wasn't quite how the ancients did it, but none of them were left to tell him. As he set up the portal, linked his body to it, and cast plane shift. He was looking for a unique world, a world that would be a rather big discovery. As he cast his mind into the vastness of the universe, he found something. A world seemingly devoid of the divine touch. As he went there, as his body would appear, he would stretch. Finding that wizard spells didn't work, he chuckled. Of course they didn't. They relied on the weave. And this world had no weave, since Mishra had seemingly not visited this world. He had to admit, he felt cocky. He had discovered a world not even the gods had touched. And luckily for him, his sorcerous nature allowed him to use magic, since instead of the weave, he could just draw on something more primordial. But he would have to walk around and try to find the materials to build a gate on this side. He had a bag of coins and didn't speak the language. After a while, it was rather taxing, until he met a young woman. She had dark green hair, compared to his light green. He smiled and she handed him a burger that he ate happily. And that was the first meeting of the two. Zeref would take the name Hisashi, and the woman would be Inko Midoriya. He would continue his research in this strange world as they would eventually marry. He had built a gate back to Faerun, his home plane. Inko, who at this point had a baby Izuku, didn't want to move to Faerun. And frankly, Hisashi didn't necessarily either. He was fascinated with quirks, the power of this world, but was also disappointed. Without divine magic, healing was ironically less advanced, despite Faerun being close to what humans in this world would call the Renaissance period. Since in Faerun, all one had to do to get healing was to go to a priest for anything serious, and it would be healed. Lost a limb? If you got to a priest within time, they would cast Regenerate, and you would get a new limb. Even the human disease of cancer was trivial when you had magic that could either remove the growth or just simply kill it outright. Hisashi also didn't want to give up all of his prestige. He was from a sorceress family, and had taken the path to higher knowledge to extend his magical knowledge. He had even been an adventurer for many years. He decided his goal would be connecting this world to Faerun, introducing the wonders of magic. And to that goal, he would bring simple gold coins to the world people would call Earth and would sell them. This would accumulate a decent amount of wealth he would use to travel. He had found similarities between Earth and Faerun and decided to investigate it. After all, investigating on both sides would hopefully give him a method to create a permanent and stable connection. This would result in Midoriya growing up without his father, for the most part. When Midoriya was 4, he would be told he was quirkless. He would begin getting picked on, as Hisashi would come to visit. He would spend a few months, as Inko would tell him. Hisashi would look at her and say, "Well, it's not surprising. Technically, I don't have a quirk," as he actually laughed. Inko thought to slap him for a second, as Hisashi said, Midoriya should be fine. I'll teach him magic. There's no doubt in my mind he has the sorcerer's blood in him." As Hisashi would walk up to Midoriya, who was watching All Might's video, as Midoriya would be crying, as Hisashi would say, "So, how are you doing?" Midoriya would sniffle and say, "I was told I was quirkless, and how am I going to become a hero if I'm quirkless?" Hisashi would smile devilishly, and he said, "Do you want me to teach you, I guess you would call it the quirk of my family?" Midoriya would look up and say, "You need be born with a quirk, everyone knows that." Hisashi would say, "Well, my family's quirk is rather unique. Just ignore that whole bone joint nonsense. I have actually 2 joints in my pinky toe, and I can do things that many quirks can't." As Hisashi would cast dancing lights, Midoriya would look around and say, "I thought your quirk allowed you to breathe fire." Hisashi would say, "My quirk isn't fire breathing, it's something more complicated. I guess." Midoriya would look at him and say, Your quirk doesn't have a name?" As Hisashi would say, "I guess I never gave it one. You would probably call it Sorceress Spark, or maybe just Magic, or as I'll probably call it for you, the Gift of Magic." Midoriya would look at him and say, "Magic's in fairy tales, it's not real." Hisashi would laugh. "Oh, my sweet summer child. I shall teach you true magic. Magic that will make any want-to-be hero jealous." As Hisashi would send word to most of his contacts, saying he would spend 6 months with his family, as he would begin teaching Midoriya the basics of magic, leave him books on how to use sorceress magic, and also silently decide he really needed to tell his family that he actually was already married and had a son. He winced at the fact that his mother would not be thrilled at the fact that he was already married and never told her. As Midoriya would get older, Hisashi would regularly make check-ins, teaching him more magic. Midoriya's friendship with Bakugo wouldn't be as bad. Bakugo wouldn't actively taunt him, particularly after Midoriya cast Create Water and soaked Bakugo. Bakugo then was zapped with a shocking grasp, as Bakugo, after that day, when they were 10, would stop calling Midoriya Deku. Instead, Bakugo would call Midoriya Sorcerer. Midoriya would come to his dad and say, "Am I a sorcerer?" And to that, Asashi would just say, "Well, yeah." Midoriya would shrug and say, "That's what Scotchan's calling me now." As Hisashi would just say, "Okay?" With Hisashi completely missing the fact that it meant to be insulting, since for his entire life he had been called sorcerer, and it was not considered a offensive statement. Inko would worry about her child, but between the magic training and Hisashi being more in their lives, things would go smoothly. Midoriya had aspirations to be a hero, and Hisashi would start putting the finishing touches on his work. We flash to roughly a year before Midoriya would attempt to take the UA entrance exams. He would come home and see his father talking with his mom. He would walk in, and Hisashi would say, "Midoriya, I have something to tell you." Midoriya would walk forward and say, "My research is going to be done soon, and I'll be leaving for possibly a year." Midoriya would nod, a little sad that his dad wouldn't be there for when he took the UA entrance exams. "I asked a good friend of mine, Ragnar, to help you train." As Midoriya would look, Ragnar was a man easily over 6 feet tall, raven black hair, and blue eyes. Ragnar would put out his hand to shake, and Midoriya would shake it. Midoriya would be shocked on how much force Ragnar put into the shake, as the Ragnar would smile. "Nice to meet you, kid. Your father's told me many things about you, including you want to be a hero." Midoriya would nod. "I guess you could say me and your dad had many adventures." As Hisashi would nod and say, "Midoriya, once I finish my research, there's going to be something I'm going to want to tell you." Midoriya would say, "Why can't you tell me now?" Hisashi would laugh and say, "I don't think you'll believe me. You could say it's otherworldly, and could possibly change the world." Midoriya was surprised that his dad asked this man to help train him. Ragnar definitely didn't seem like an intellectual person. But it was only a few days later that Midoriya realized what his dad meant. Since being a hero required you to have certain physical attributes, as Ragnar began working with Midoriya to help build muscle. Though Ragnar said he was looking for a good place to train him. We had flashed to a couple days later with Midoriya in class, as the teacher threw career application tests into the air, just exclaiming, "We all know you're gonna at least try the hero track." Midoriya thought that the teacher wasn't exactly being that responsible. After all, there was no way everyone in this class would be able to even qualify to take a hero test, as Bakugo actually voiced this in the most untactful way possible. Bakugo would get on his desk and say, "Come on, Teach, we all know that these extras would be lucky to become the sidekick of some D-lister." As this wound up kicking up a lot of angry comments from the class. As Midoriya started questioning if he should do something, Bakugo then said, "After all, me and the sorcerer are the only ones who are going to be qualifying for UA." As Midoriya mentally facepalmed, Bakugo had dragged him into this. As Bakugo went to boast some more, Midoriya would make some gestures with his hands, as Bakugo suddenly found that he couldn't open up his mouth. As Bakugo would glare at Midoriya. Midoriya holding his hand in the position you would expect someone to hold over someone's mouth. Bakugo quickly jumped at Midoriya, as all you could hear was, "Let go of my mouth! You..." As the teacher said, "You two! Knock it off or you're going to go to the principal." As Midoriya released Bakugo's mouth as he said, "Don't you think about doing that again with, what, your mage hand?" Midoriya shrugged. He had found it rather useful. As the day would go normally, as like in canon, he would be attacked by a sledge villain. He wasn't able to put up a defense, with the sledge quickly filling his mouth and restraining his arms. This resulted in Midoriya not being able to really cast anything, as All Might would save him. Though this time, Midoriya would ask for an autograph and simply asked, "Can someone become a hero with a almost magical quirk?" All Might would just laugh and say, "Bizarre for someone to call their quirk magical." Midoriya would simply get the autograph and not ask All Might any major questions. The next day, he would show it off to Bakugo, with Bakugo being impressed, though also teasing Midoriya for not being able to get out of the sludge villain's grasps. As we would flash to a couple days later, as Ragnar asked Midoriya and Bakugo, as he would say in a thick accent, "I think I found the perfect training ground for you," as he gestured with his arms. It was Dagobah Beach. The currents had resulted in a lot of trash arriving at the beach, and people began dumping, turning what was once a beautiful beach into a beachside trash dump. As the man said, "You'll train your muscles by moving the trash. And since almost no one actually checks on this place or really cares what's destroyed, you can unleash your attacks to their fullest. And as long as you don't make too much noise or too much of a spectacle, no one will necessarily care." The two boys looked at each other, interested in the challenge. Both boys would spend the next several months moving trash. Picking up different sized bits of trash allowed them to work different muscles. This wouldn't get them jacked into the traditional sense, but it would allow them to have an overall decent muscle buildup. As Ragnar would also ask Midoriya's mother to start cooking some different meals. Meals much higher in protein. As Ragnar would actually take an interest in Bakugo's anger. As Ragnar would bring Bakugo to his side one of the days of their training and said, "I see you have much anger. I'll help train you to hone it. I also had a temper when I was young, and the fathers and elders of my village helped me to hone it." Bakugo would shrug the help, but thinking it was something akin to counseling. After Ragnar had brought him aside a couple more times, Bakugo finally relented, being pleasantly surprised that it was actually how to direct your anger at your opponent. As we would approach the day of the UA entrance exam, Bakugo and Izuku had separated training 2 months ago to work on their own individual skills without the others seeing. Midoriya had broken through a fairly substantial wall when it came to his magic, being able to cast more powerful magic now, along with Ragnar teaching him how to actually use a sword. Ragnar said he didn't think Midoriya would ever substantially use it, but he had seen heroes with swords and other physical weapons before. And in Ragnar's own words, "If you do not train in an art, you will need it." Midoriya had chuckled and asked, did that advice ever come in handy for him? As he said, "Yes, and it was your father who got me out of the situation." Midoriya, being intrigued, would ask, "What issue was that?" Ragnar would laugh, a deep, bellowing laugh. "It was actually math and reading. Midoriya looked at him puzzled as he just said, I had gotten into some trouble with a contract with a merchant. He had been swindling me and my entire village until your father came along and just casually mentioned that we were selling him more products than the contract said we had to. It saved us a lot of work. As Midoriya asked, what happened to the merchant? Ragnar would laugh and say, well, before pausing, clearly thinking for a second, and said, I'll tell you when you're older. As Midoriya would prepare for the UA entrance exams, he would also do more reading, mastering more magic. He had written an entire new journal on the subject, piling it with his hero notebooks. You would look to see almost 10 full tomes of Midoriya's experiments with magic. As Midoriya would go to the exam, he would be a little nervous and trip. He would be saved by a brunette-haired girl. Midoriya would get up and thank her as she walked off. As Midoriya thought for an extra second, he would just hear someone say, I see you are starting to think like a man. Midoriya, with a slight blush on his face, would turn around and see Ragnar. Midoriya would turn his head and ask, what are you doing here? UA's offering parents the ability to watch their child's exam. Midoriya said, but you're not a parent. Yes, but your mother asked me to take a look and see how you were doing. Midoriya thought that would be something his mother would ask him to do, as Ragnar would walk towards a building with signs saying, visitors, observation. Midoriya would go in as President Mike would give the presentation, introducing the monsters. A kid with glasses would stand up and call Midoriya out for his muttering. Midoriya would be a little frustrated at this, mostly because though Midoriya had been muttering, he didn't think he was being that distracting, especially since the boy was, frankly, pretty far away. He would understand if it was a complaint from someone right next to him. But that student was, was several rows away, and as President Mike would say, oh, you're talking about the 0-pointer. That's an obstacle. Midoriya would put his hand to his chin and think that there was probably something more. After all, if it was a challenge, you wouldn't forget to mention it. Midoriya would rush in. As he rushed in, he saw the brunette-haired girl being a little nervous, as he would just give her a thumbs up. As the exam would begin, he would be casting fire bolts and many other spells, chromatic orb, chaos orb. Though both of those took a good bit of power. The spells would tear through the robots. He would also assist people who had gotten over their heads. But then he would hear something rumbling. The 0-pointer would arrive. It was huge. Midoriya started to think, even for a challenge, that's a bit much. As he would prepare to fall back and try to hunt some more robots, he would hear a voice. He would turn over and see, he would look and see the brunette-haired girl from before under collapsed rubble. He would rush forward, happy for Ragnar's strength training, as he would be able to push the rubble off of her and lead her away. The test would end, and Midoriya would get the girl's name, Ochako. Midoriya was fairly confident he had managed to beat the exams. He had prepared so much for the written, and he was pretty sure he had done enough to get through the combat, though he had lost track. What he had noticed, though, was that a lot of bizarre events were occurring. He hadn't had time to think about it during his training, but things like auroras appearing in places that you wouldn't expect them to, like South America. The auroras even made odd shapes, even for an aurora. Some looked like hands working, while others looked like faces. He had also noticed that he felt his power differ. Instead of just drawing on the power deep within him, he could draw power from around him. He was a little confused. He could feel the power and the world around him, and he could tell something was changing. As Midoriya had received his letter, and he had succeeded. In fact, he was third in the entrance exam. He was so excited. He was even more excited that All Might would be teaching, apparently. But odd stuff still was happening. He had been going online and joining a bunch of conversation boards. Turns out he wasn't the only one noticing. People had also mentioned that their quirks had been acting up, as he filed all of that away. As he would use a technique his father showed him to send a message to him, telling him that he had gone into UA, and that he had even managed to get to third. Reinhardt had apparently managed to land a job, though he didn't tell Midoriya what it was. As over the next weeks, Midoriya would just simply get everything ready. As he would go in for his first day of school, he had managed to get to his class without much issue. But as he was walking down the hall, he would recognize someone. As he looked at Reinhardt and asked, "Wait, is that you, Reinhardt?" As Reinhardt said yes, as he would take a second to explain. Apparently when he went into the parent observation, a thing that Reinhardt would have sworn looked like a possum had asked him if he was interested in a job. Reinhardt had been confused and asked, and apparently the thing that Reinhardt said was named Nezu explained to him that Nezu could tell that Reinhardt had some experience, and was wondering if he wanted to be a combat teacher's assistant. Reinhardt had nodded since he wanted something to do besides watch Midoriya. After all, stuff back at home for Reinhardt had been kind of slow, and he didn't want to go back just yet. As Reinhardt quickly hurried him to Class 1A, only saying that the teacher might be a piece of work, he would arrive. Midoriya would be the first to notice the thing he at first thought was a giant caterpillar, only to be revealed it was their teacher in a bag. Aizawa would do the normal quirk apprehension test, as Midoriya would manage to get a pretty good score on all of them. But when Midoriya went up for the ball throw, Aizawa would try to counter his quirk, only for him to realize he couldn't, as Midoriya would cast a spell as he would disappear into mist, appear 30 feet in the air before throwing the ball. This wouldn't be tremendously useful, but it had managed to get a pretty decent score, before energy would surround him and he would fall to the ground like a feather. Aizawa was confused, as this would continue. Events not really standing out tremendously. He had the first day with All Might coming in, saying that he was entering the room like a normal person. Midoriya would geek out, while also thinking that All Might was probably really nervous to make that corny of a joke. But the combat training would go mostly without a hitch. He would be teamed up with the Ochaku, a girl he found rather interesting. He had been too timid to really talk to girls before this, but she was really outgoing, and Midoriya was starting to really question why he all of a sudden started feeling butterflies in the stomach anytime she happened to be around. And one day when him and Bakugo were walking home, he would mention this to him. As Midoriya started going into a muttering fit about wondering if it had something to do with her quirk, or before Katsuki would just punch him in the back of the head, as he would just say, "You have a crush." Midoriya would swallow hard, as his mouth would move without saying anything. Katsuki would laugh and say, as Katsuki would walk ahead for a second before having a grin, Midoriya would have a chill, thinking that the grin kinda looked like some sort of imp, realizing some horrific, cruel torture he could do. As Katsuki would look back at him and say, "If I get to your house before you, I'm telling your mother!" As Bakugo would rush forward, Midoriya would take 2 seconds to realize it and rush after him, saying, "Hey, Kachan, get back here!" As Katsuki would laugh as he would rush forward, simply saying, Little Deku's actually starting to think like an actual man." As Midoriya would manage to almost cheat on the race by using Misty Step when they were at the foot of the building to get up first, as Katsuki would just chuckle. Though the training with All Might would be the first time the rest of the class talked to Reinhardt, as he would give everyone some creative criticism on strategy and ambush, with All Might wondering where did Nezu find this man, since some of his suggestions were rather gruesome, like suggesting Yorozu on ways to make traps that could cut someone's foot off, to recommending to Kaminari to have some sort of chain or string weapon on him, so he could use it to direct his electricity. He also seemed to suggest to everyone to at least try to get one weapon, since many of their quirks were only as good as their fists. And in his own words, fists are only so good until they break. If you have a weapon, you will always have your fist to go back on. But weapons do cause more damage. Some of the students seemed to like him. UA would have what the students would come to refer to as the reporters incident, where it seemed that a bunch of the reporters managed to get past the defenses, triggering a massive panic thanks to the attack alarm going off. And the events would occur the same as in the original series. But as a couple weeks went by, Midoriya would start to wonder what his dad was doing. Meanwhile, his dad was dealing with all the political implications, as we flash to what Asashi was doing, or known in this world as Zareth, as he was sitting down sweating bullets. His mother and father, both half-elves, would be staring down at him, as his mother would say, "So, when were you going to tell us that you were both married and had a child?" Hisashi would just gulp and say, "It, didn't cross my mind," as she gave him a death glare, as she said, "You're telling me it didn't cross your mind to tell us that you had a grandson, the future of the noble Zareth house, and that you had been training him?" Hisashi would gulp again and say, "I was busy, trying to rediscover ancient portal magic," as she would look at him and say, "You listen here. Next time you go back, at least one of us is going to go with you and meet our grandchild." As he said, "Yeah, no problem." "Well, in that case, I gotta go." As he looked at his father, as he had a somewhat resigned look on his face, as he was a little bit debating, as she said, "Quite funny, you'll be taking us there within a month." As he gulped and said, "No problem." As she also said, "Oh, and by the way, we are not happy." As Sasashi would chuckle, as she said, "By the way, did he inherit your muttering problem?" As Hisashi would lower his head slightly and say, "Yeah," as she would laugh and say, the Zera family. Why do all the men in it have a muttering problem?" As his head would peek up and say, "Wait, what do you mean all of them?" As she would just laugh and say, "Your father has the exact same problem. In fact, that's the reason why he hasn't mentioned anything so far. He's simply learned how to mutter in his own brain." As she would nudge him, as he would say, "We are very, She would just break out and laugh and say, he's probably been muttering about the implications, about having active portal travel to the other world and having a grandchild." As he would just say, "Yeah." As she just said, "Well, time to get all the preparations going." As he would say, "What?" As she would give him a bit of a devilish smile as he said, "Well, we're going to be traveling in about a month, and I think we're going to stay there for a while." As Sasashi would say, "Okay." As she would also say, "I have to make sure to pack your baby images." As he would go pale and said, "I thought those were destroyed. You know, that freak fire." As she would said, "You know how that spell works. And besides, you don't think I only had one copy." As Hisashi would just have a look of horror on his face. We'd flash to Midoriya. They had been doing school for about 2 weeks when Aizawa had gathered them all up and said, "Today we are going to be going to an offsite facility called the USJ for rescue training. Please proceed to the bus." Midoriya is excited. Lesson in rescue work. Though he didn't remember seeing Ragnar. Saw him early in the day. He shrugged and got on the bus, not knowing that this day would be a notable day in his life, and it would be rather concerning. As Midoriya and the rest of Class 1A traveled to the USJ for training, we'd flash over to what Ragnar was doing, which was trying to run to the school because he was late. He hadn't overslept tremendously, but he wanted to get on his armor and pack a few potions, since technically this wasn't combat, but he had seen how crazy it had gotten. He wanted to get some healing potions and whatnot that he had brought with him. All that resulted in him underestimating how long it was going to take, so he was busy rushing to school, finding out that the class had already left, and jogging to the USJ, so he hopefully wouldn't get a lecture from Aizawa. Since he had met the man a few times, thought it reminded him of several rogues he had met, one he had even traveled with, and thought that either he had a tragic backstory, was just a normal pain, or just decided to be insufferable because he didn't want to deal with people. Either way, he was jogging to USJ. Nezu was actually impressed that he was able to jog at that speed with, well, full armor, and all of his weapons. As flashed the USJ, where 13 was giving her explanation of how quirks can be incredibly dangerous. Midoriya nodded, knowing this was the case. As someone mentioned, "Hey, is there supposed to be fake villains?" As everyone looked over, Aizawa looked puzzled, but when he looked down, he said, "Everyone stay back. We're under attack." As a large shadow appeared, as it began disgorging villains, including one covered in hands and another one with a bird-like face and what almost appeared to be its exposed brain. Midoriya was starting to wonder, how did this happen? but judging from the smoke, he assumed that it must be because they had a teleportation quirk. And those were incredibly rare. As Aizawa jumped down to confront the villains, as he managed to start holding them off. The students would try running for the door as that shadow would appear in front of them. Bakugo and Kirishima trying to jump into combat with it before half the group being teleported away. Midoriya would come through in the earthquake zone. As he quickly focused his mind and cast a spell, Identify Life. As to his shock and somewhat horror, he saw dozens of villains. Grimacing, he prepared for combat. As luckily for him, Bakugo and Denki, a boy with a lightning bolt through his hair, who Midoriya found had an electrical quirk, had both been teleported there with him, as the villains barely knew what hit them. Midoriya used a spell called Ice Blade, as he crafted a blade of ice and began fighting, unleashing minor spells he called cantrips. As he was rather surprised. He didn't expect these villains to be this weak. As Bakugo said, yeah, it makes Ragnar's training seem like, it was on hard mode. As Bakugo blew up another villain. In other parts of the facility, other students had been teleported. Battles had broken out. And to most of their shocks, most of the villains were actually pretty weak, unexperienced, and with very few villains that were even at the students' level, which was frankly embarrassing. As Midoriya had remembered something the villain had said right before they had disappeared, that they were there for All Might. As we flashed to Aizawa, disappointed in himself for letting that shadow guy get away, especially after he teleported half the students. As he'd be facing off with the other villains before the man with many hands decided to rush him. As Aizawa would fend him off, the man would touch his elbow with all 5 fingers, as it seemed to have decayed or rotted. Aizawa hopped back, realizing that his elbow was almost shot. And seemingly right as this man was going to say something, the mist villain shot past him, seemingly running from something, as the shadow villain dodged an axe, as Ragnar had arrived 2 seconds earlier. 13 had been heavily injured by the mist villain, as the other students were trying to get around him. Ida was almost around him, having trouble opening up the door, as he got knocked back, thinking that he was going to be captured, as the doors rushed open as Ragnar walked in. In 2 seconds, he saw the mist villain and brought out an axe and charged him, telling Ida to run back and get help. As the mist villain was surprised by Yue's part-time combat instructor. But before he knew it, Ragnar punched him in his physical body, sending him flying quite far, as this warp villain quickly realized that this man was experienced and ready to rumble. Flashing back to the present, Ragnar got in front of Aizawa and asked him how he was doing. Ragnar said, "Your arm got injured," as he detached a small vial, handing it to him. As he said, "Drink it. I already gave one to 13. Hopefully she'll be back on her feet soon." Aizawa sniffed the liquid. It didn't smell bad, the reddish liquid, but as he was pondering it, Ragnar said, "Either pour it on your wound or drink it. We have 2 enemies in front of us." Aizawa felt a little ashamed for being scolded by the man. After all, Aizawa was technically the senior teacher. As the man simply told Aizawa, "Can you neutralize the big guy's quirk?" Aizawa said yes, and said, "Do so, please." as Aizawa began dampening the quirk, as Kogiri said, "Nomu, get him." As Nomu rushed forward, Ragnar managed to just dodge the fist before landing a slice with a short sword he had pulled out. As the Nomu yelled in pain as it swiped down on him, he let go, activating, as he just said, time to go into rage. As he put down the sword and pulled out his large axe. It was a dual-headed axe. As he said its name, Frostbiter. As blue mist started wafting off of it, and as he just yelled back to Aizawa, "I should be able to fight him as long as you keep his quirks down. I'll keep him from getting to you." As Aizawa was a little surprised, but he attempted to do it. He had drunk the potion and had already felt his arm slowly mending. It felt similar to Recovery Girl, but he didn't feel as tired. But Aizawa was concerned that he had already used his quirk so much, he was already starting to feel the effects of dry. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. As the Ragnar and the Nomu did battle, the Nomu, still, despite all of his quirks being neutralized, was still faster. But Ragnar clearly had more skill and experience, managing to usually not take the brunt of the damage. Though Ragnar's armor had clearly been dented in several places. As this fight would continue on, Aizawa critically trying to keep his eyes open to keep this thing's quirks neutralized, the doors would open again, revealing All Might. And he was not smiling. And that's where we're going to leave it. Little thing to keep in mind, I intended on this being longer, but this is a good ending point, given the fact the rest of it's going to be mostly a fight. I was actually recording it earlier and realized that I had already gotten like 11 minutes of content recorded, so I have most of the next part already done in the recordings bit. And I probably would have added that on if I had another couple days to get this video out. But if you, say, give this video 10 likes and a few comments, I think I might just put out the next part soon instead of taking a break, because I've been putting out content non-stop for the last like 2 months. And I'll probably take a week off here coming up before I introduce a new series and probably return to what if Midoriya was Yami's reincarnation, because the compilation did super well. But without further ado, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Liking helps tell me you like the content. Commenting tells me what exactly you liked about the content. Sharing tells your friends what you're watching. And subscribing tells you when I put out more. With that being said, this is Will signing off. Hope to see you around the channel. All Might would arrive, pushing through the doors. Ida had successfully gotten to the school, and All Might had been the first to arrive. Other pros would be shortly arriving. As All Might rushed down, Aizawa and Ragnar would be relieved. As All Might would tell Aizawa to focus on the kids, he would confront this Nomu creature. As the man, covered in hands, identified himself as Shigaraki and mentioned that this was Nomu, an artificially created creature to kill All Might. As Ragnar said that he was pretty sure his physical hits weren't doing any damage to it, suspecting that there was some kinetic resistance. as All Might would attack at once and agree with that sentiment. As the battle would begin, Aizawa would be forced back since quirk exhaustion and stopped using his quirk. All Might immediately noticed how what went from simple resistance had apparently turned into absorption, as Ragnar confronted Shigaraki and Kodagiri. As this fight go on, Ragnar would notice that he had been hurt pretty bad. Several ribs were definitely broken, and it was his rage and adrenaline was what was keeping him going. As we flash to where Midoriya, Bakugo, and Denki had been teleported to see many villains knocked out. It looked like a mini war zone going off with how many explosions and other things had managed to pretty much take everyone out. As Denki commented on Midoriya's hero costume, asking where did he get that armor. Midoriya, who had remembered that Ragnar had given it to him after the first hero training exercise, saying that his dad would want him to have it. It was a green scale shirt. It was light armor and resistant to quite a lot, primarily poison and acid. Midoriya said, "Yeah, it's some sort of leather. Not quite sure where my dad got it from." As Bago barked at both of them, saying, "The rest of our classmates are scattered about the USJ." As Bago said, "Lightning bolt for brains." Denki looking mildly offended. "You're with me." And Deku. Midoriya would look up. "You check on Aizawa. Me and the other guy will try to see if we can help some of our other classmates." As Bago hurried off, as Midoriya would start jogging towards the center, running into a couple villains, but he noticed one of the zones was almost completely covered in ice. He assumed that Todoroki must have gone there and probably was fighting. As we would flash back to the main battle, as we would see Ragnar starting to feel the effects of both adrenaline and rage wear off, having a harder time keeping up with Shigaraki. Shigaraki, on his part, sported several new bruises, and had found out incredibly annoying fact for him that this guy's axe was not decaying. Ragnar smiled. It seemed that this guy's decay ability only worked on mundane objects, and Frostbiter was a very magical item. As Ragnar rushed towards Shigaraki again, Shigaraki would stand still, and a smile would occur. Ragnar realized his mistake too late, as a warp gate opened up underneath him, teleporting him 30 feet into the air above the rest of the students by the door. He would land with a big thud, the last remnants of his rage fading as he lost consciousness. As the others would focus on All Might. All Might had been fighting the Nomu as he attempted to do a suplex, hoping to bury him into the concrete. But unfortunately for him, that Miss guy, with Shigaraki mentioning his name as Kodagiri, had managed to teleport the upper half of the Nomu to attack All Might, as he was in a bit of a sticky situation. And this is what Midoriya saw when he approached. Midoriya, feeling a sense of rage, would charge in, charging magic, not caring what spell he used, and unknowingly doing something that most sorcerers would find a very bad idea. As he tapped into the power, it felt like a weave now. As he tapped deeply into it, it felt like dice, or something else had been rolled. As he charged towards Kodagiri and Shigaraki, hoping to incapacitate him and force them to let all might go. Kodagiri would open up a portal, and Midoriya would let out the power. As chaos broke out, Midoriya unknowingly had cast wild magic. After all, he didn't really care what the magic did, as long as it would do something to Shigaraki. As Midoriya charged towards Shigaraki, focusing magic, preparing to unleash it, Kodagiri would quickly move, opening up a portal to catch the attack. As Midoriya released the attack, the portal and the attack would mix. As Midoriya's eyes widened, well, everyone's eyes widened, as both powers clashed and a silvery light emerged from it, with many colors. As it expanded and exploded, energy wafting out, lightning and whatnot. Shigaraki was hit, being incredibly close to it. Midoriya threw out shield, as he managed to block the brunt of it. As Shigaraki would be forced to close his eyes, Todoroki would manage to freeze the Nomu's arm, and All Might would escape. But all of them would be forced to close their eyes as the light would break out. When they opened up their eyes, there was a major rift, and it seemed to pulse. Shigaraki would get on his feet and say, "Kodagiri, what did you do?" As Kodagiri would not be sure, as a creature would walk out of the portal. Congratulations on making it this far. Now, if you like this content, which I'm pretty sure you did if you stick around this long, please like, share, and subscribe. Liking helps me know that you want more of this content. Commenting helps us have a discussion, along with giving me some of your ideas. And subscribing makes sure you get more of it. And liking allows your friends to also see it. Hope you enjoy this. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. And this will be Spurry. Sign off.